pay $60 billion to set up an NGO. Bill Gates, right? So he's given more than 60% of his wealth, and when he dies, he's going to leave 95% of his wealth to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And in the space of the last 5 or 7 years, that foundation has done more than the United Nations, the World Health Organization, governments in affecting malaria, water supply. So NGOs do have power, and you could call them special interest groups, but I'm thinking of more loose organizations. How about unions? Right? In India, the unions do have a major role to play. If you want anything done, if the union is not in line, if they're not supporting it, it's not going to happen. In the US, in the 50s, about 70% of the workforce was unionized. Last year, that percentage had dropped to 11%. So unions have lost a lot of clout in the US, and again, there are reasons aplenty, and they have to do with all these other factors. But nevertheless, there's a whole women's movement, right? That's a special interest group. I read the papers over the last 2 months that I've been in India about SC and ST and so forth. Those are special interest groups, and they have a great deal of impact on what happens in education, in hiring for the government. So special interest groups can have a major impact on businesses. So, given that we have a black box, that's the organization with inputs, outputs, and processes, all being affected by these technological, social, and political factors, environmental factors, how do you evaluate the performance of any organization? How would you characterize one organization as being successful and the other one not? How would you do that? How would you measure the performance of an organization?
Talent scorecard.
Yes, somebody in the back. Comparing the profits of your company with another company? Sure. That's called cross-sectional analysis. How am I doing relative to my competitors? In psychology, they call somebody that you compare yourself to the referent other. So it doesn't even have to be somebody who's in the same business. As a company, you don't have to compare yourself. The notion of best practices is that you want to compare yourself in best practices in the industry or even in society. So that's one way of doing it. How else can you do it? Yes?
The level of efficiency, maximum outputs with minimum inputs.
Excellent. So efficiency is a measure that can apply to any organization, right? Output over input. For every dollar or rupee of input that I put in, how much output am I getting out? That's a hard and fast, clear measure of performance. You can see that. So, for 1 rupee of advertising, if I can get 2 rupees of sales, that tells me that my advertising and marketing is pretty effective. But then when I compare myself to the company down the road and they're getting $5 or 5 rupees of revenue for every 1 rupee of advertising, then I know that I'm not doing as well as them. Anything else that you can compare performance
By comparing the cost,
to?
is the cost implied by one company as compared to the other company?
Yeah, but that's,
This is a major phenomenon according to which the profit and all is dependent.
yeah, so that goes back to efficiency again, right? Cost is an input, and then profits are outputs, and you can take return on sales, return on profits, return on investment. These are all efficiency measures. Go back to that input-output model. I said the most important thing is the last item, which was goals, right? So how can you devise a performance measure based on goals? Customer satisfaction would be one of those behavioral variables that you can pay attention to.
So meeting the organization standards.
Yes. In other words, you can have all the efficiency in the world, but if your main goal is not being met, if you are Bill Gates and you want to wipe out malaria in the next 5 years, but all the money is being eaten up by the bureaucrats in between, the money is not getting to the heart of the problem, you can say, oh, I spent $1 billion and I produced the vaccine that is being distributed in Asia and Africa. But if the patients are not getting that vaccine, then you're not really meeting your goal, right? You can be very efficient in producing the vaccine, getting it to where it needs to be, but if it doesn't go that last mile, you are not being effective. So that's the other measure of performance. In fact, I argue that these are the only two things that you should compare when you are comparing companies' performance to other companies. But we left out one point. How else do you know that you're doing well? By comparing your performance this year with your performance last year, right? Time series analysis. So there are two kinds of comparisons that you can do, one with yourself and one with others. So effectiveness and efficiency. Now those of you who are mathematics oriented, what is the flaw with the goal of being effective? What's the problem?
So efficiency cannot be achieved because effectiveness is basically to do the work on time. This time is related, but the efficiency.
Look at the formula, right? Effectiveness is what you are actually producing, the results, and you compare the results to what you wanted to achieve, the goals, right? How can you improve your effectiveness? By lowering your expectations, right? So if you say that whatever course you're in, that if I get 50% marks, I'm happy, that's my goal, you get 51%, you can say, hey, I'm very effective. But you know that you better get 95% if you want to get to the next level. So effectiveness, even though it is the more important thing, can be manipulated by lowering your expectations and then saying, how good are we, right? Efficiency is how much bang for the buck you can get. That is, for every dollar or every unit of time that I put in, how much am I getting, and how does that compare to last year, and how does that compare to somebody else? So you need both. I don't speak Japanese, but I'm told that in Japanese, they do not have two words. They don't have a word for effectiveness and they don't have a word for efficiency. They have a word which means both, that it is difficult, if not impossible, to do one and not the other. Kanban, exactly. All right, so with that as the setup for the topic, which is the new global economy, one question that I have for you is, if you look at economic analysis of the past 5 years, 50 years, 500 years, is the past prologue? What that simply means is the past a useful guide to what's going to happen in the future? What do you think? This is a philosophical question. There's no right or wrong answer. Yes? Well, first of all, if you are an economist or a forecaster, you don't have any other information, right? You only have the past information. If you're relying on data, if you're making a forecasting model, basically what you're doing is you're using some kind of model, a Box-Jenkins model, and you're trying to predict what's going to happen next. The problem, of course, is that you may be able to make short-term forecasts, but the further out you go, the more nebulous things become, and the wider the range of error that can creep into your forecast. A friend of mine says that if you're going to make predictions, make a lot of them. Some of them will be right. All right, so having lived in the US, I mean, that's where I am, so that's where I have the data, but I tried to find other information to give you a bigger and broader perspective. So, in terms of the economy, this is what has happened every quarter for the last 12 or 15 quarters. So, we had the recession starting in 2008. The economy actually shrank, and it's sort of operating at about 1.5 to 2% over the last couple of years. So based on this, it seems to be a pretty flat model, and the prediction would be that the US is not really going to be contributing much to worldwide economic growth. Let's look at the other big gorilla in the room, China, and this is what China has done in the same time frame. So the numbers there were 1 and 2%. Here, look at China's numbers. But look at the last 8 or 10 quarters. Based on that, what would you predict? You would project that. But remember that model, the environmental factors, they're all working in concert. This decline in Chinese growth can be traced directly to the American housing bubble that burst in 2007 and 2008. So, based on past data, that's what's likely to happen. All right, back closer to home, in India, the numbers are slightly less than China, but still, nevertheless, the trend is there, but it's steeper. So, if China is not going to predictably do well, then by that same logic, India is going to do less well. Let's combine all of the GDPs and see what we get. So that's the world GDP growth for the last 5 years. And as you can see, the total, the orange line is declining at a much lower rate than India or China, or even the US for that matter. And there seems to be a cycle. So one of the things that comes from economic analysis when you look at long periods of data is that there is cyclical movement in the data. I think I have a chart later which shows, or maybe I took it, oh, it is there, okay. So you would project that the economy is still going to grow, the world economy, but maybe not at the way it was doing 2 years ago. This is another way to look at it. Unfortunately, I couldn't find the graph to bring it up to 2012, but you can see the trends, right? The US is still the big blue, and they seem to have about 30% of the world's GDP with a slight decline. The EU seems to be faring worse. They seem to be declining at a greater pace. But look at the red line. That's Asia and Pacific, excluding Japan, right? Japan is now lumped in with the Western economies. So Asia, which is what? India and China, in essence. And look at that growth pattern. So if you project these, somewhere in a few years, the red line will overtake the blue line. So, we saw some cyclicality. We saw some changes which are pointing in the downward direction. I asked the question, is the past prologue? What do you think is, I said one major factor, but it turns out to be the major factor that's going to affect future growth? What do you think that is? Population. Not directly, but indirectly, these two are related, the one that I'm thinking of. If the world is primarily growing in the past because of industrialization, because of manufacturing, what is the biggest need for manufacturing? Anything. Which? So there's a little bit of humor in there. Waiting for one shoe to drop so that I will then have a pair. Energy. That is the one major element that is going to affect everybody. Yes.
It's come now, so I just want to switch for 1 moment.
Oh yeah, sure, no problem. Take another break.
Class, a small break here for 2 seconds. Actually, just switch over in the system because light had gone. Now it's come back. There's a little bit of problem, so we can enjoy the darkness for one single moment here. So meanwhile,
And the other class is coming in, right?
They're already in the hall.
Oh, they are, okay.
Yeah.
So we didn't take a break.
So would you like to have some tea, coffee?
No, I have water here. That's good.
Should I open it for you? How is it going?
Good.
You know what? You can even ask them to answer a few leading questions.
Yes, well, that's what I'm trying to do.
Would you like to use a collar mic? In that case, you can,
I'm loud enough.
relax.
I'll get it.
The lecture is very interesting.
Huh?
Yeah, it is.
Yes, they want to their family known
Tea, coffee. I love of tea. So I like some tea. Some chai ले आओ।
इसको शंकर को
नहीं, शंकर को ही बोलूँगी।
people are advertising this 18.7.5 lakhs per year expenditure for MBS. 18.75. हमारा क्या है? What Chief Secretary has fixed, that is what it is. And that also, when the final exam was to commence, 2 days before students are changed. I said, okay, I'm looking at this. Private है, आ जाएगा, ये तो 3 days before the final examination, the student is paying the rest of the 60% fee which he has to pay here. ठीक है, मिलेगा। इस तरह से like this यहाँ दूसरा टाइप का है। This idea is waiting for middle and lower middle class. Because I will be
All right. So, as I was saying, energy is the main resource that the world needs, and given the current state of affairs with our dependence on oil and coal, both of which supposedly are creating climatological problems. This is what the projection looks like. The GDP is that blue line, so that's very nice. But both the energy use and the carbon dioxide emissions are also increasing, and the pace seems to be going to be faster than the GDP growth. And again, if you project ahead into the future, at some point, that's going to become a major problem. So if we can switch from non-renewable energy resources, the sooner we do that, the better it will be. All right, just to take one example, here's crude oil. Right, these are the prices for the last 12 years. And they went from $20 a barrel in May of 2000, $25, $30 a barrel, and they're hovering around $90 to $100 now. Anybody know what the price of oil was from 1953 to 1973? $2 a barrel. So the first oil shock, when the OPEC nations decided that, hey, we have the world at our fingertips and we want to exert some power, it went from $2 a barrel in 73 to $12 a barrel by 74, and it hasn't looked back since. So it's around $90. So if you think about any industry, any business that relies on energy, and even if they're getting it from coal, indirectly, those coal plants are relying on where does the coal come from, right? It comes from the mines. It has to be transported. How does it get transported? By trucks. Trucks use what? So you get the idea. It's a cyclical thing, and oil is really one of the major problems. And according to projections, we were going to run out of it in 2050, but now they found a new way to produce oil from shale. And so that gives us another 25, 30 more years. But by the end of this century, there are going to be major problems if we don't find alternate sources of energy. So here's a U.S. example, what happens when the price of oil goes up by $10 per barrel. $10 per barrel is 25 cents at the gas station or petrol pump, as they say here, which translates to $25 billion of additional spending by the U.S. consumers, and that has a direct impact of decline in the economic growth rate of 0.2%. So just by a change in price of oil, your economic output actually declines. That's how direct the linkage is, and so that's a major problem, not only for the U.S., where manufacturing has basically become a small percentage of their GDP, but for countries like China and India, which are trying to grow. I was telling Mahendra Saab that 3 years ago I was here in Pitampura, and the whole place was dug up for the metro, the overpass, and the roads, and it was a mess. And there was a whole bunch of trucks coming in with cement, with steel, whatever it is, and I thought that it would never get done. So I'm actually very pleased that this has become not the hell that it was 3 years ago. But all of that means that that's being replicated in India at every street corner, in every city, between cities, the highways. And it's going to mean that oil consumption in India is going to continue to rise. It's going to rise faster than the GDP. And if we don't find more oil in the Arabian Sea or the Indian Ocean, we're going to have to import it. So again, back to the U.S., this is what has happened to the cost of living. CPI is the consumer price index, it's the inflation rate, and in 40 years, it's basically gone from 10 to 200. So everything is more expensive. And this is what has happened to the U.S. balance of trade. For the last 10 years, they have not had a positive balance. So they're importing everything. The good thing in the U.S. as far as oil is concerned, that their reliance on foreign oil has gone from 50% to 40%, but that still means 40 cents on every dollar is going to the OPEC nations. In the next 5 to 7 years, they're predicting that the United States will become a net exporter. Thank you. They will become a net exporter of oil because of the shale. But there are political consequences because they want to dig up in Alaska, and the environmental special interest groups are out there protesting. And every time there's a problem or a disaster, what happened with the oil spill, the BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico a couple of years ago, that has a huge environmental cost, and that slows down production. There's a classic story. In the 60s, the Tennessee Valley Authority was building a dam, and that dam was Tennessee Valley is in the middle of America, economically depressed area, and so they thought that by building the dam they would get power, electricity, development, industry, and all of that. And the project was supposed to take 2 years. It was on a fast track, and the Sierra Club, I don't know if you've heard of it. Sierra Club is an environmental group, special interest group. They filed a lawsuit against the Tennessee Valley Authority, and 14 years later, it got done at 30 times the cost, the original cost. And why? The Sierra Club found that by building a dam, this little fish, this 1-inch fish called the snail darter, would be affected and might become extinct, and they just went all the way through the court system using the legal process. So, that's a major problem not only for the United States, but it's becoming a worldwide problem as well. I believe that the Narmada Dam project was affected by environmentalists in the past. So the U.S. balance of trade is still, and that's another projection if you make, they're going to keep importing more than they're exporting. And the coffers of China, which is where most of the money is going, they're going to keep growing. So how are they financing their operations in the U.S.? Well, they do that through the borrowing facility that the government has. What do you think that big spike is? The bigger one. The Second World War. Basically, the Second World War was financed through debt, and the 50s and 60s were relatively quiet, manageable borrowings. But look at what's happened since 2000. They keep borrowing more and more. Finally, the Republicans said earlier last year that we are not going to let you borrow more unless you cut spending, so that you have at least a balanced budget. But last week they caved, and they're going to let them borrow more. This is the cumulative debt since the 1800s, since the founding of the country. And that total accumulation is, on an annual basis, as percentage of GDP, it's over 100%. So the U.S. economy is about $14 trillion, and their total debt is $16 trillion. And it's being projected by economists that if nothing changes, if you freeze all the conditions now, it'll grow to $50 trillion in 20 years. During that same economic crisis, you had these bank failures. But the spike is not in 2008. That big spike is in the early 90s. This is when the US government changed the banking rules, and the savings and loan, which is a form of banking organization that was governed separately, they introduced more deregulation and greater competition, and so hundreds of banks disappeared, got merged and taken over. But in 2010,